Hello, and welcome back to our discussion of logical fallacies. Specifically, these are informal fallacies that we're discussing now. And for this next video, we are going to pay close attention to different kinds of fallacies that are committed by offering up irrelevant premises, right? Premises that do not actually pertain to the main contention of the argument, fallacies that have premises that are directing us away from what we should be paying attention to. They're distractors, you might say. Now, one thing that I do want to make a point about is I'm actually going to go in the same order that you find in the Vaughan textbook, right? So we're going to begin here talking about the genetic fallacy. I'm not sure why Vaughan puts it in the order that he does, but I don't want to give the false impression that any of these are more important or more persuasive than any others. That may be true, but the order that we're going in has nothing to do with that. Instead, I'm just following the same order that you find in the Vaughan textbook. So let's begin then talking about the genetic fallacy. So what does this fallacy say? Basically, the idea is that it occurs, this fallacy happens when someone either accepts some claim or rejects some claim simply because of the origin or where it came from. And here, when we're talking about the origin or where some claim comes from, we're not necessarily talking about the person that it comes from, right? So that's a different kind of a fallacy. Here, it's better to think about it like the origin story, or like how did this claim develop in the first place? So again, this is a kind of fallacy of irrelevance. So it's a fallacy that's directing us away from what we should be paying attention to. And here, the idea is that where the content of the claim originated simply is not a relevant factor with regard to whether or not that claim or that belief is true or whether it's false. So another way to put that is its origin story is not a contributing factor with regard to its truth or falsity. So if it turns out that you accept or reject some claim merely because of where it comes from, then you're not going to be concerned with the content of the claim. But again, this is not saying that it's because of the person who is offering the claim. That's actually called an ad hominem argument where you're attacking the person. And we'll look at that type of fallacy later. So now what I want to do is consider some examples of this type of fallacy, some simple ones. Well, here's an example. Somebody says she's a Hollywood actress, so you can't trust what she has to say about climate change. Notice that this is a fallacy because the mere fact that some person is a Hollywood actress isn't going to tell you one way or another about whether climate change is true or false. That's not a good reason to reject that particular view. Or somebody might say that the belief in souls or the belief in some sort of psyche comes from Greek philosophers, namely Plato. Right, Plato believed in the tripartite soul. Right, so therefore it must be true. Plato said it; it must be true. Well, the mere fact that Plato is a Greek philosopher who we all respect, and many people think that he was a great, amazing philosopher, but that doesn't make everything that he says true. The mere fact that he says it doesn't give us reason to accept it. Now imagine that somebody claims you believe in democracy because you were born in America. But if you lived your whole life in China, for instance, then you would see that democracy is totally corrupt. Well, the mere fact that you live in America doesn't tell you one way or another whether democracy is corrupt. That belief might be true or it might be false. Merely where you were born can't give you any reason to accept it or reject it. Or imagine somebody complains that some particular scientific theory came from some liberal, so therefore, because liberals are so terrible, it must be false. Well, again, it may be true that liberals are terrible, or it may be true that liberals are great. Who cares? It doesn't matter with regard to whether some scientific theory should be accepted or rejected. So now that we've seen some simple examples, I want to turn our attention to a very famous example. This example actually comes from Nietzsche in his book called On the Genealogy of Morality. For Nietzsche, he argued that Christian morality grew out of a kind of slave morality. The basic idea was that these people were poor and they were largely under the control of the Romans, who were mighty and ruthless. And so, this kind of morality that he attributes to Christianity got its origin in this sort of slave morality or this kind of way of thinking that was sort of slavish in some particular way. This view was associated with resentment, right? The weak people that were under the authority of the Romans resented the strong authority of the Romans. And he claims, very explicitly that values like humility, meekness, and charity, that these weren't discovered objective truths, right? These sort of values or moral attitudes about the world, they're just something that grew out of this particular moment in time. Right? They were not objective truths, rather, they were invented. They were a sort of survival strategy that were being used because they were living under the authority of these Roman rulers, right? These rulers that they resented. So since these people did not have power, they resented them, and then what eventually happened was they took power. Eventually, Christianity took over the world. And then that morality is the morality that everybody sort of accepted at that point later on. So essentially, Nietzsche is arguing that this view, this Christian sort of morality, this is false because its origin is in weakness and this sort of resentment of the Roman rulers. And so you might think that this is committing the genetic fallacy, that it's a way of saying that we should reject this Christian morality because it has its origin in this kind of resentment. But is it really? Is this really the genetic fallacy? We might want to pay close attention to some of the details here. While many scholars do think that Nietzsche is offering some version of the genetic fallacy, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone believes this. Some scholars interpret Nietzsche as doing something more subtle, something a bit different. He's not simply saying that morality is false because of its origin. Rather, what he's doing is showing how its origin reveals its function. Of course, Nietzsche does still reject this sort of morality, as well as the sort of function that may be revealed by its origin. Specifically, Nietzsche does argue that this sort of function clashes with true human flourishing and true human vitality. So, if that's correct, then it may not be committing the genetic fallacy. Another way of putting this is he may be offering a kind of genealogical critique rather than a logical proof, right? So it may be better to understand this as an objection rather than a reason to accept or reject some belief. So we can't be too quick whenever we're attributing fallacies, because it might be the case that Nietzsche is using genealogy here to undermine the value of morality rather than to try to, refute some particular belief about morality. Now, I'm only mentioning this point because I think that it's important to pay attention to the details and the nuances involved. And we'll see how that works with regard to different sorts of fallacies. Let's go ahead and turn our attention now to the fallacy of composition. This fallacy occurs when we think that the parts of something has a property to the further claim that the whole thing has that property. So let's think about that a bit more. Here we can think about it in terms of some part X has some property P, whatever those things might be. Therefore, the whole thing that's made up of X has property P also. Now, I think it's going to be helpful to plug in X and P here with some more information. So let's think about some examples. We might say that every player on the team is great, therefore the team is great. Well, that's just not the case. We could definitely have, amazing players on some basketball team, and that team could do a really poor job for lots of different reasons. So the fact that the players are all great doesn't necessarily make the team itself great. Another example is we might say each statement in the book is short, therefore the whole book is short. Again, that's just not true, right? It's easy to think of a situation where you have a massive volume, some huge book that's thousands of pages long, that's comprised of very short sentences. Maybe each sentence is only a few different words, but nonetheless, the book is huge. Right. So the mere fact that the book has a lot of different short sentences doesn't mean that the book itself is short. Now I want to turn our attention to another example that is sort of famous in philosophy. This is an argument that's offered by John Stuart Mill in his little pamphlet called Utilitarianism, where he's arguing for what he calls the greatest happiness principle, where the greatest happiness principle is basically telling us that we should maximize the greatest amount of happiness overall for the greatest number of people. So what he writes here is that happiness is desirable as an end. Here's what he actually says. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually do see it. In like manner, then, I can apprehend that the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people actually do desire it. All right, so far so good. He goes on to claim then that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. The happiness of all is a good, the aggregate of all persons' happiness. So this might be a little bit complicated to see what exactly is going on, but let's try to figure out what exactly the problem is. Where is this composition fallacy being committed here? All right, so Mill is attempting to move from the claim that each person desires their own happiness to the further claim that the general happiness of everyone is a desirable end, right? It may be true that everybody has this property that they do desire happiness for themselves. That doesn't necessarily mean that the aggregate of all people is a happiness that's desired also. This is what I kind of mean by that. Even if we grant that each person does, in fact, desire their own happiness, logically speaking, it does not follow that the sum total aggregate of everybody's happiness is what each person, or anyone for that matter, actually does desire or should desire. So essentially, what's happening is Mill seems confused, right? He confuses what is desired by individuals like you or me or anyone else with what is desirable as a general end for everyone. Or to put it another way, the move from the individual desire to the collective good is an illicit logical leap. We cannot move from the claim that may be true that everybody in the group has this property of desiring their own happiness to the claim that the whole group of people, the aggregate of people, also have that property. Now, there's a similar fallacy that's called the fallacy of division. This fallacy is sort of the flip side of composition. This fallacy basically tells us that the fallacy occurs when you end up assuming that what is true of the whole must also be true of its parts, right? So you can see then how it's sort of the flip side of the composition fallacy. Or when we assume that what is true of a group must also be true of each of its members in that group. So again, I think it'll be helpful to consider some examples to help make this particular fallacy clear. Well, consider Pearl Jam, my favorite band. Pearl Jam fans are well known for being politically active social democrats. Well, here I am, Christopher. I'm a huge Pearl Jam fan. Therefore, Christopher must be politically active and a social democrat. Well, the mere fact that this band, Pearl Jam, clearly are politically active and are largely, as far as I can tell, social democrats, that doesn't necessarily mean that any of their fans are. It doesn't necessarily mean that I am. Or consider another sort of similar example. Taylor Swift fans are very dedicated and they're willing to travel for her concerts. Now, suppose that you are a Taylor Swift fan, you're a Swiftie. Therefore, you must also travel all over the country for her shows. Well, no, that does not necessarily follow. Maybe you don't have enough money or the ability to travel wherever Taylor Swift goes. Those concerts are very expensive, but that doesn't mean that you're not a fan. You can still be a fan even though you don't go to all of her concerts. Or consider another example about movies. We might say that the genre of Marvel movies are widely popular, right? The group, the whole thing, insofar as we've got this genre of Marvel movies. Well, yeah, they tend to be popular. Therefore, every single Marvel movie is also widely popular. But we know that that's false. Different Marvel movies have not done well at different points. So that does not follow from the mere fact that Marvel movies as a genre is popular. Or consider a pretty straightforward example that says this car is lightweight. Therefore, every single part of the car must also be lightweight. It simply doesn't follow. There are definitely many parts of the car that are not lightweight. Take, for instance, a tire. A tire is heavy, right? Or different parts of the engine, right? Different mechanical parts of the car can and certainly are heavy. Even though we might say that the car itself, as a collective whole, has a property of being lightweight in respect to maybe another car like a truck or some other vehicle like a van or something. Or consider a novel. Maybe this novel is exciting, therefore every sentence in the novel must also be exciting. Well, if anybody's that's ever read a book, even a book that you really like, you'll definitely come across a sentence at some point where you might think that was awkward or wasn't very interesting. Or consider a mathematical example. The number 12 is divisible by 2, 3, and 4. That's just a fact. But it does not necessarily follow that each of its digits, 1 and 2, must also be divisible by 2, 3, and 4. Mathematically, that does not follow. It's actually false. So I think those examples of this particular fallacy of division are helpful. So then in the next video, we will turn our attention to a different fallacy that we mentioned previously, the fallacy of ad hominem, which is appealing or attacking the person.